twentyonepilots just released their new album, Breach, and on that album there is a song entitled City Walls, which also had a music video. And this song and music video end the story, in a way which many, including myself, found to be quite tragic, but which also in the very final moments do provide a glimmer of hope. Then later that day, on Friday, after releasing the full album, they also released an extended version of it, the Digital Remains version of Breach, which contained one bonus track entitled Drag Path. Now that song is going to be the subject of today's video because I think there's quite a lot which it has to tell us, both about the lore as a whole and also about a potential alternate ending to the story, which I believe is at least hinted at, if not explicitly revealed in that, and which also I believe has been already shown to us throughout the music videos that we've already been given. Now I can already hear the keyboards typing away and the commenters come rolling in saying, well, you're just coping. You didn't like the ending to the story, so you're trying to find some other meaning, some other explanation for what was really happening here. So I don't buy this theory because of that. It's just a cope. And to that I would say I actually loved the ending. I think City Walls ended perfectly. But then the band chose to give us even more information. And I think there are two endings to this story because I believe, as I have held for quite some time and explored extensively in my final theory last week, that there are two Clancys at play here. We saw the ending to the story of one of them, and we were recently pointed towards the ending or the future end of the story of another one. Let's get into it. Now, before we start to worry that the story is going to have more endings than The Lord of the Rings, I mean, if you think about it, we're supposed to have an ending in Paladin Strait, and then the contract gave us that exact same cliffhanger, and then City Walls ended, and we got that ending, and then they released Drag Path, and there's a new ending. Is there going to be more? Is there going to be a third album? Well, I don't think so. But I also didn't think there was going to be a second album. And yet, here we are. But regardless, I do very much think that there will only be two endings here. Because, once again, I believe there are two Clancys, and I think it makes perfect sense to say that there should be two endings for the two Clancys. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's backtrack to City Walls. I did a breakdown of that video quite recently, and in that, I mentioned that I noticed two things. One, Clancy at some point knew that he wasn't going to make it out in this attempt. Some point early on in the story, maybe even at the moment of Heavy Dirty Soul, but if not then potentially in Jumpsuit or Levitate. At some point during his journey, he knew this wasn't going to be the time that he made it out, which leads me to my second point. Maybe what we see at the end of this video, at the end of the story, was the Torchbearer's plan all along. Maybe this Clancy always was destined to become a bishop, and not only that, he was supposed to. It wasn't just that Nico overcame him and he lost to himself, it was that he was supposed to lose to himself. This was the plan that the Torchbearer devised, the plan that he was worried the Banditos would lose faith in, because it seemed so crazy. There are some lyrics in the song City Walls itself which seem to point to this. Ideas like, it was always the plan for me to come and unseat you, which, instead of just destroying or defeating you, implies unseating and replacing you as a new leader. That was always the plan. We also saw things throughout the Clancy tour that hinted that it was pretty inevitable that Clancy was going to become a bishop. It was just whether or not he was going to become a good bishop, but it seems that that was never actually an option. But how does this tie into Drag Path and a potentially alternate ending? Well, ever since Drag Path has been released, everyone has been saying this is pointing towards a happier version of the ending. Certainly the song seems to speak to that. It's a substantial 5-minute song, and in it, it describes leaving evidence for someone to discover, to come find them, and at the end of the song, it seems that whoever it was they wanted to find them has. And because of that, the devil mentioned in the song has been defeated. Now, I think there are two ways to interpret this song, and both of them are equally valid. One, the song could be addressed to the Torchbearer, and two, the song could be addressed to a future Clancy. In fact, I think both of these interpretations can coexist together. The song, in many ways, could be addressed to both. And then, depending on who was listening to it, you would hear the song in a different way. In one sense, if you're the Torchbearer listening to it, Clancy, now becoming a bishop, is asking him to find future Clancy and help him through the cycle. But if you're listening to it as future Clancy, you're receiving this message from your former self, saying, I left you evidence so that you could find me and set me free. And by setting me free, you are setting yourself free. That's really what's going on here. So let's explore that aspect, the idea that it was written to his future self. Well, what evidence do we have for that? Or what evidence do we have for a future self at play here other than just a new cycle beginning, someone starting it all over again? Is that really a future self or just the same person now going through the cycle again? Well, as I mentioned a moment ago at the start of this video, I believe the 2 Clancy theory is alive and well. Now, this was a key aspect of my final theory, and in the idea that I had before City Walls came out, before Drag Path came out, I believed that the version of Clancy that we saw as the main Clancy depicted, the one whose narrative we were following, was the one who was going to make it out. He was the final version. He was the last chance, the last attempt. And that there was a second Clancy, his past self, who had been operating as Keon's and had kind of been time traveling around as the Torchbearer helped him kind of help his future self. Now, there's a lot of evidence for there being 2 Clancys, and I think significant evidence for there being one who's in the past or present and another who's in the present or future, depending on which perspective or which point in time you're looking at it. If that's confusing, don't worry, I'm going to unpack that more in a second. But first, the main thing that I think I got wrong in that theory, which now it's become clear that it doesn't quite work, isn't quite right, is that the Clancy we saw as depicted as the main Clancy wasn't the final version, and wasn't the one operating alongside his past self. He was actually operating alongside his future self. So in other words, I just got the perspective or the point in time flipped. The main Clancy, the one whose narrative thread we see followed, who's the main character, the main focus of this narrative, is existing, you could say, in the present moment. Really, I think he's existing in the past, but that's a little convoluted and confusing to really think of the story in that way. So let's just say he's existing in the present, and there's another version who's existing in the future. He's the one that the Torchbearer goes to find at the end of City Walls, the future cycle, the future Clancy. And he's the one who we see almost as a ghost, flitting in the background of these different music videos. We see this very clearly in Jumpsuit, and what's interesting about Jumpsuit is that Heavy Dirty Soul ends with the cycle starting over again. Heavy Dirty Soul ends at the beginning of the video once more. And then in Jumpsuit, we see 2 versions of Clancy. Presumably, the one going through the main events of Jumpsuit is the same one who went through the main events of Heavy Dirty Soul that we saw depicted. The one in the background is the one who is starting to arrive at the very end of Heavy Dirty Soul as that car starts coming around the bend again and the video starts to replay itself. So main Clancy goes through those events of Jumpsuit, and his future self, behind him, watching from afar, has just gone through the events of Heavy Dirty Soul, and then watches him go through the events of Jumpsuit, and then heads into Trench to go through the events of Jumpsuit himself. He exists in the future, he's learning from his past versions, his former self's mistakes. Now again, he's not the main Clancy. I used to think that the main Clancy was kind of learning from his past self's mistakes, and the past version was the one flitting in the shadows, but really, it's his future self. Again, this idea of a time loop is coming into play. It's inevitable. It's happening time and time again, so much so that each version of Clancy might know, or at least might be able to communicate, as we'll get into in a moment, with his future self. So his future self knows what's about to happen and is able to avoid making the same mistakes. And maybe they slip up. They do make some mistakes, or they do one thing right but get something else wrong. They make a note of that. The future attempt, the next one in the loop, can learn from that. And they pass this on. They pass this evidence etched in the surface, these clues hidden around, the same clues which we, as the clique, as the fans of this band, have been trying to unravel ourselves, and which together ultimately will help this future Clancy escape. So, how does Drag Path tie into this? Well, we get those lyrics. A drag path etched on the surface as evidence I left there on purpose. I dug my heels in the gravel as evidence for you to unravel. He's leaving clues behind so future versions, future iterations can find him and know who he is, can come up against him in the tower and know that Nico is Clancy, that he is his former self, and vice versa. But where does he record all of this information? Where does he leave all of this evidence? Well, where else? Where else other than in Clancy's journal, in the websites, in the Dima.org website, in the letters sent out to members of the clique, all of which were marked as evidence. This is what Clancy left for his future self to uncover. This collection of notes, not just from one Clancy, but probably from multiple. And that's why the accounts don't always line up, why they don't always make sense and don't always have perfect continuity, but blatantly don't. It's not just mistakes and poor writing. These are intentional continuity errors. We see events happening from 2 different perspectives or multiple different perspectives, several accounts of the same thing, because several different Clancys have gone through it and had slightly different experiences. One Clancy saw another one getting seized in jumpsuit and made it farther into trench because he was able to avoid that, but then someone else tracked him down and brought him back nonetheless. And then he recorded that, so perhaps the future attempt will make it even further, and so on. He's an escapee getting better at every attempt, making it further through the breach. Not only that, the lyrics in Drag Path are even more explicit, right? It's not just evidence, it's a drag path he left there on purpose as evidence. This is a record, his journal is a record of all his failed attempts, and what is a drag path if not that? Him failing to escape and being dragged back into Dima. At least that's how it's described in the I Am Clancy video. So not only do we see a moment of hope at the end of City Walls when the Torchbearer sets out to help in another attempt and to try again. He has hope certainly that one day they will succeed, and that's supposed to give us hope. And then we get this song which has even more hopefulness to it. That you found me and we won. And this might not be the next attempt. This might not be 10 attempts later, but at some point he will win. It just can't be now, because that's not realistic. And that wasn't the story of the main Clancy that we were following. But at some point, what he did in this cycle, by gathering together this journal of notes and becoming the bishop at the end, will help some future version of himself escape and finally be free one day in the future. And that is the hope at the end of the story. That is not some vain hope. There's real evidence that that will actually happen. And not only that, we were given a brief glimpse at this Clancy from the future, the one who makes it out. It wasn't dwelt on super long, it was only in one video, but it was a substantial part of that video. And that video was Paladin Strayed, in which we see Clancy sitting on the cliffs as the sun rises, singing to his past self, finally free of Dima. So yes, the story does end in tragedy. The Clancy who we have been following fails, loses to himself, and becomes a bishop of Dima. But there is unmistakable hope in the story. And this song, Drag Path, and the ending of City Walls both very strongly and explicitly confirm that that is the case. That being said, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to comment your own thoughts on this song and this theory below. And don't forget to subscribe for more music commentary and reviews.